our last video, we looked at some of the early research on conformity, including Ash's classic study of conformity. In this video, we're going to look at Stanley Milgram's classic research on obedience. And Milgram was in part interested in Ash's study. He said, this is fascinating that so many people conform in this task, but he also said, well, probably they're conforming because there's no cost to conforming. No one gets hurt just because you conformed on Ash's task. So why wouldn't you conform? Go ahead. There's no harm. But he thought, if you were actually going to harm somebody with conforming, surely you wouldn't. Or at least you'd be less likely to conform. So he's going to ask whether we're likely to obey an authority figure when that authority is asking us to do something harmful. And he's doing this work after World War II. And part of what people were struggling with is trying to explain the atrocities of World War II. So, for example, Eichmann was on trial for his crimes as part of the Nazi final solution. And people went to this trial really expecting to see a monster. Because of the terrible things that he did, they thought he would look like a monster. But Hannah Arendt, who covered the trial, said he just looked like a petty bureaucrat. And what was Eichmann's answer when asked why he committed these terrible atrocities? He said, I was just following orders. And Milgram wondered, would everyone follow those orders? Is that just a German thing? Or is this something that's more generally a human tendency? And so what he did was he created a study in which an authority figure is going to ask you to do something. So if you came to Milgram's study, the experimenter meets you and the other participant and says, well, this is a study of learning, and we're particularly interested in the role of punishment. Will punishment help you learn better? So one of you is going to be a teacher and one's going to be a learner. We'll just draw slips out of a hat, and so you draw the slip that says teacher, and the other man says learner. So we go set up the learner. The experimenter puts him in the chair in a little room and puts his hand on a shock plate and says, okay, so you're going to try to learn these word pairs, and when you get an answer wrong, you're going to get an electric shock. And the learner says, I just want you to know that I have a heart condition. Are these shocks dangerous? And the experimenter says, no, the shocks are painful, but they're not dangerous. And so then the experimenter goes and sets you up in another room and says, so what you're going to do is read a series of word pairs to the learner and then test him on those word pairs. And if he gets one right, that's great. But if he gets it wrong, you're going to punish the wrong answer by administering shock. So you press down these levers on the shock machine, and the shock machine goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and each lever is 15 volts higher. You start the task, and the learner's getting a lot of questions wrong. He's getting a lot of these word pairs wrong, and you're giving electric shocks that are higher and higher and higher, and he starts to scream and protest. And what do? Now, this is all staged. There are no real shocks. Nobody's actually getting hurt. In fact, it's all scripted. So the learner has specific prompts at certain shock levels. At certain shock levels, he'll say a certain thing. These are pre-recorded or they're acted out in the same way each time. And as the shock levels get higher and higher, he protests more and more and screams, says he won't give any more answers, and then falls ominously silent. The experimenter, too, is scripted and basically has 4 prompts. If you say you don't want to go on, the experimenter says, please continue. If you continue to resist, you would say, the experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no choice. You must go on. So if you just describe this study to people, as Milgram did, most think that obedience won't be very high. So psychologists predicted that very few people would obey to the end, just sadists. Really, no one's going to obey these commands all the way to 450 volts. And most individual people feel quite sure that if they were in this situation, they would not obey. But in fact, in this version of the study, Milgram found that 65% of the participants obeyed all the way to the end. So there are really 2 questions here. One is, why do so many people obey in this situation? And why don't we know that in advance? Why are we wrong in our predictions? And let me just give a couple of factors that we know don't explain these results. So Milgram's results are not because these particular participants are atypical. He ran a lot of replications, so it's not just these particular participants. There have been a number of more modern replications, some using Milgram's format exactly, some using a slightly different format, and the results are sometimes a little different, but again, you don't get dramatically different results. So this is not just because these particular participants were atypical. It's not because they're sadistic. I mean, the participants are very concerned about the learner. They want to know if he's doing okay. Can we go check on him? They look nervous. They look upset. They're not enjoying themselves. And although some of the participants may have known it was fake, I don't think most knew. And there were several replications where you really couldn't know that it was fake. So, example, one study asked nurses to give a prescription medication to a patient that was double the maximum dose. And there's really no way the nurses could know that that was fake. It looked just like any other doctor's signature. And yet 9 out of the 10 nurses were willing to administer a potentially fatal dose of medication. It's really, I don't think knowing that it was fake was a good explanation for the results in this case. So what does explain the results here? Why do people obey? Well, there are a lot of different factors. It's actually not a single answer. One is that if you ask people after the experiment, why did you continue to shock the learner? They will often say, I didn't. I stopped. The experimenter made me go on. So they don't necessarily seem to feel responsible for their behavior. And in part, the experimenter fosters that, because when they say, I won't be responsible for this, the experimenter says, I'm responsible. I'm responsible for everything that happens here. But most of us, when we look at this, we think the participants are also responsible for their behavior, that the experimenter is not the only person who's responsible. So here we're seeing a decrease in the sense of personal responsibility, but not necessarily actual responsibility. In one variation, the teacher's role was actually split into 2 parts. So the participants were just reading the list of words, but a confederate was administering the shock. And what do you think? Do you think more people obey or fewer? Well, more people obey. In this case, more than 90% of the people obey all the way to the end. Why? Because they might say to themselves, I'm not actually administering shock. I'm just reading a list of words. I'm not hurting anybody. But the problem is that reading the list of words is part of the experiment. And if you stop, the shock stops as well. So you may not be directly hurting anybody, but you're part of this large evil machine that's hurting others. And a lot of the Nazi war criminals said things like, I didn't kill anybody. I just put people on trains. They didn't necessarily feel personally responsible for the harm because they weren't directly administering it. So that decrease in a sense of personal responsibility makes it easier to obey. The shock generator is another piece here. Remember, the shock generator starts at 15 volts and goes all the way to 450 volts, and each shock is only 15 volts higher than the last. And I think most of us, when we think about this, if you were to administer a 15-volt shock, that doesn't seem like such a bad thing necessarily. You might think to yourself, that's not a big deal, that's not wrong. And if we asked you to administer 450 volts right away, you would say that's wrong. So we have a sense that the highest shock is wrong and the lowest shock is not that big a deal, but it's hard to figure out where it becomes wrong in the middle. So I think part of this is that people lose their moral rudder. They lose their sense of what's right and wrong because they can't quite figure out when the task becomes wrong. And this is what we call a slippery slope. Each step doesn't seem that different, but in the end, you end up somewhere you weren't expecting. And part of this, too, is because you start to feel committed to your previous behavior. That is, if this shock is wrong, then wasn't the last one wrong? And if I gave that one, then maybe there's a little bit of justification of your behavior or even some cognitive dissonance that's actually going into justifying your behavior here. And there's some good research to say this is how people get trained as torturers. You don't just throw somebody in and say torture. It's gradual. You gradually escalate their inclusion in the activities until they find themselves torturing and they kind of can't figure out how they got here. So the task is part of this. There's also the learner is part of this. So the learner in the original version is in another room, but you hear him screaming and protesting. What if he's in that other room and you don't even hear him screaming? You hear some muffled thumping on the wall at the high shock levels, but you don't hear all that screaming and protesting. Are people going to be more likely to obey or less? Well, they're more likely to obey. In this case, 93% of the people obey to the end. What if there's less distance? That is, the learner is in the same room and you actually have to take his hand and put it on the shock plate to administer the shock. Are you going to be more likely to obey or less likely to obey? People are less likely to obey. Only 30% obey to the end. Now, at a pragmatic level, if he's in the same room, in some sense, you should be more willing to administer shock because you can at least make sure he's alive and okay. You can check on him. In the other room, you're not sure. But people are less likely to obey. Why? Because you have to watch his suffering. His suffering is so palpable. It's right there. There's something about the distance to the victim that makes a big effect on how willing you are to obey this experimenter. Now think about war. Today, in today's wars, do you have to be up close and personal to hurt someone? No. You can fly over and drop bombs and never see your victims. You can do this remotely with drones. And that makes it much easier to obey an authority figure who tells you to kill others, right? So this is part of the explanation. But some of it is not just physical distance, it's also psychological distance. When we dehumanize the victim, see them as less than human or not a good person, we also make it easier to hurt them because we are psychologically distancing ourselves. Every major atrocity, all of the attempts to eradicate people's genocides, they have always been accompanied by a systematic propaganda effort to dehumanize the victims, to say they are not like us, they are not really human, they are closer to animals. And that makes it easier to commit this harm. The experimenter is a significant part of this. So in part, the experimenter has a strong role because he looks like a legitimate authority, right? He's wearing the lab coat, he's at Yale University, and you might think to yourself, well, surely they would never do anything wrong at Yale. Well, that's a big assumption. Certainly some very prominent institutions have done things that are wrong. But what if we take this out of Yale? One of the variations Milgram did was he did this in a seedy office building just in the middle of town, not associated with the university, not a scientific study. And here it's just a market research study. It says Bridgeport Market Research Company. But the experiment is run exactly as is. The guy's wearing the lab coat. He does the same experiment. It's just not at the university. Are people more likely to obey or less? They're less likely to obey. So in this case, only 48% obey to the end. But I would like to point out that although that is less than 65%, it is still the case that almost half of the participants are willing to obey an authority figure who says to shock somebody. And this person is not a scientist. They are a market researcher. They're not affiliated with any kind of known institution. So this is still a very powerful effect. Why is that? Why is it that the experimenter has such a powerful role? Part of it is because the situation is ambiguous. And I think this is what's hard to see when you're not in it. When you're in this situation, it's very unclear. Most of the participants had not been in studies before. They didn't know what to expect. Many of them said things like, I don't know much about electricity. And it's this very ambiguous situation. Well, what do we do when situations are ambiguous? We look around to see what other people are doing. Well, the only other person there is the experimenter. And the experimenter says, please continue. And you can see it in the videotape. If you look at tapes of the research, you'll always see it. The learner screams and the participant turns around and looks at the experimenter. And the reason they're doing that is they're trying to figure out, what does this screaming mean? Is this something we should worry about? Or is this not a big deal? And the experimenter says, please continue. And by saying it so calmly, the experimenter is basically saying, don't worry, this happens all the time. It's fine. I mean, imagine if the experimenter heard the scream and said, I think you should go on. I mean, that's not persuasive. Part of this is the mannerism too. So part of what's difficult here is that you only really have one source of information, the experimenter. And the experimenter is very consistently, through all of their mannerisms, he's saying, this is fine, keep going. What if you had some other teachers there? So in one variation, there were two other teachers as well, and they refused at different shock levels. So one refused at one level and then the other refused. Are people more likely to obey or less? They're less likely to obey. In this case, only 10% obey to the end. Because having those other peers there, first of all, gives you an ally. Remember Ash's study? This gives you somebody to stand up against the normative social influence. But it also gives you information that maybe I'm right. Maybe this is the wrong thing to do. Maybe my concerns are valid. because here they're resisting as well. So it gives you some information that you don't have from just the experimenter. What if you had two experimenters and they disagree? In one variation, Milgram had two experimenters and one said, please continue, and one said, stop. Are more people likely to obey or less? In this case, 0% obey. When the experimenters disagree, these are the most important sources of information, and when they cannot agree, we are not going on until they get to agreement. So part of what this is that the situation feels more ambiguous when you're in it than it seems from outside. And I think that's important to remember because many situations feel ambiguous when you're in them, even though from outside or from hindsight they may seem clearer. The experimenter's distance also matters though. So if the experimenter's in the same room, as you saw in the first study, you get about 65% of the people obeying. What if he's not present? He gives instructions at a distance. So he has some tape recorded instructions and he calls in every once in a while to see how you're doing. Are people more likely to obey or less? Well, they're less likely to obey. In this case, only 23% obey to the end. Now, if the experimenter is a source of information, then you should obey him anyway. I mean, in the army, it doesn't matter whether the general is in the room or not in the room. You're just supposed to obey their orders because they're the ones you're supposed to take orders from. But in this case, something about their presence is part of the effect. So the experimenter being there or not there. Now, why is that? Part of it is that the participants think they won't get caught. They actually cheat. They stay on the same shock level longer when the experimenter's not there. So some of it is the physical monitoring. But some of it is also what you have to do to stop the experiment. So if the experimenter's not there and you want to stop the experiment, you just stop giving shock. You just sit there and stop. And you don't have to explain yourself. You don't have to do anything. But if the experimenter's in the room, you have to say something. You have to say, I think we should stop because, and your because is going to be some kind of, this is wrong. That is, you're being asked to confront the experimenter. And that kind of moral confrontation turns out to be hard, particularly when you're not the victim. When you're the victim, it's easier to do this. But when you're not the victim, it's actually very challenging to tell somebody else that their behavior is wrong. And obviously some people did, no question, but it's not easy. And so this is not so much informational social influence, this is normative social influence. So the experimenter is a source both of informational social influence and of normative social influence, because you can see that in the different variations of the study. What you want to take away from Milgram is not, and I repeat not, that everybody obeys the authority, because that's not true. In every single version of this, some people disobeyed. And they disobeyed in a variety of ways and at a variety of times. But obedience was never 100%. What you want to take away from this study and the series of studies is that whether people obey or not is partly, at least, a function of the situation. We can get obedience levels up to 93% or down to 0, depending upon the specifics of the situation. And so this is really saying that our obedience in this situation is partly a function of our conscience and our personality, sure, but it's also a function of the situation that we find ourselves in. And so this became a powerful vehicle to talk about how situations can either foster or inhibit obedience, conformity. So this is really looking at how the situation can powerfully influence us. Now, of course, the study was also enormously controversial, in part because of its results and in parts because of its ethics. Milgram always argued that this was ethical, and in part it said because when he polled participants, they were largely glad they participated, very few were sorry they had participated, that they didn't show long-term harm. He followed up with questionnaires and they didn't show long-term psychological distress. So he argued that yes, this was a very distressing situation and they were upset in the moment, but that they were fine in the long term. Other people argued that there really was a very high degree of short-term discomfort and a pretty high level of deception in this study. And the question is that ever ethical? Is it really ethical to make people believe they're harming somebody in this way and to make them this upset? More recent research has gone back to look at some of these audio tapes and argue too that the protocols were maybe not as rigorous as had been originally thought. There might not have been as consistent debriefing. The experimenter may not have been consistently on script. And so there's more variation that is also ethically troubling about the study. So it's a study that was really a flashpoint for discussing ethics. And in part, this was an important moment for psychology to think hard about what is and isn't ethical in our research. The study continues to be controversial. Some people argue that it was a very important study and was ethically designed. Other people argue that this would never have been an ethical study. At the time, there was a lot of discussion, and there continues to be discussion now because there continue to be replications and people are continuing to explore the original results and methods. So it's something you need to think about. Is this study ethical or not ethical? Would it be ethical to do a study like this today? There have been modern replications, but they changed the protocol in some ways. You should just think carefully about the ethics of research because it's a very important question. Thanks for watching.